The question is John the Baptist Elijah or not? In John chapter 1, when he was asked if he was Elijah, he said no. But when Jesus was asked about Elijah, he said that John is Elijah. So who's correct? Well, obviously both are correct, although they sound like they contradict each other. It's possible to say two statements that sound like they contradict each other, but they're not speaking about the same sense. If John the Baptist was, in fact, not the man Elijah. He was not Elijah the Tishbite, the man who had lived 700 years earlier in the days of Ahab and Jezebel. He was not the same man. And so when he was asked about that, he said, no, I'm not. Now, the Jews expected Elijah, the same man, to come back. Because Malachi had said that God would send Elijah the prophet before the great notable day of the Lord in Malachi 4, verses 5 and 6. And so the Jews expected the man who had gone up in the fiery chariot in the days of Jezebel, they expected him, Elijah, to come back. And so when they asked John, are you Elijah? They meant that. Are you that man, Elijah? And John was not. He was a different man. He was not Elijah. But when Jesus was asked about it, he said, if you can receive it, John is Elijah, who is to come. Now, what he means by that is that Elijah, who is to come, as prophesied in Malachi, is not the same man Elijah. John is, in fact, the one predicted, but he's not literally Elijah. You see, in Luke chapter 1, we read that when the angel appeared to Zacharias in the temple before John the Baptist was conceived, and the angel announced to Zacharias that he and his wife would have a child, it would be John. The angel said, this son of yours will come in the spirit and power of Elijah. And so we see that John comes as sort of a spiritual Elijah. He comes as a fulfillment of Malachi chapter 4, but it's a spiritual fulfillment. Although Malachi said Elijah would come, it doesn't mean the same Elijah who was here before. It means another like Elijah, one of whom Elijah could be seen as a type. Now, if this seems strange to us, that Malachi would speak of John the Baptist and call him Elijah, simply because Elijah was a type of John, you will find a similar phenomenon in places like Ezekiel chapter 37 and Hosea chapter 3, where the Messiah is called David. Now, the Messiah is really Jesus, of course. His name isn't David, but he's called David in the prophets. Why? Well, for one reason, because David is a type of Christ. And God did not reveal in the Old Testament times what the real name of Jesus would be. And so in speaking about him, in calling him David, it's just calling the attention to the fact that he'd be a second David. David is a type of Christ, and Christ would be this, as it were, another David coming. His name wouldn't be David, and he wouldn't be the same David. He'd be kind of another David. And that's the same thing that Malachi is doing with Elijah. He didn't know John the Baptist's name, though he had mentioned him earlier. In Malachi 3, he said that God would send his messenger before the Messiah comes. And then he calls him Elijah in the next chapter. But John isn't really named Elijah, and he's not the same man. But Elijah in the Old Testament was a type and a shadow of John. And so the prophet, in speaking of John, and not knowing what his real name would be, gave the name Elijah, as other prophets gave the name David when speaking of Jesus. The Old Testament person who provides the type provides also the name or the moniker by which he'd be referred to in the Old Testament prophets. And, of course, the real person who would come later would have a different personal name, as Jesus did, and as John did.